When your father is a leading wine authority, the world's authority on specific wines, you get a little bit of a head start in learning about wines than the rest of us. You probably get to start drinking them earlier too. Bartholomew Broadbent is from London. He has some ties with Richmond since he lives here now. His wife, Spencer, is a native. His mother-in-law, Marty Bowles, is a member here. And she was no doubt thrilled when he decided to relocate the family to Richmond from San Francisco after a number of years. His credentials are way too long to give you a full list, but here's just a partial list to tell you how huge he is in the wine world. He has worked at Hennessy and Cognac, Sperrier in Paris, Harvey's and Harrods in London. He lectures on major cruise ship lines all over the world. He hosts a TV wine show. He is a regular speaker at major wine festivals all over the world and judges wine competitions all over the United States and in London. His wine life has included wine making in China, Australia, and England. He is recognized as one of the world's foremost authorities on port and Madeira and has literally created those markets here in the United States. He is a master of the science and artistry of wine. Additionally, he is successful in the business of wine. 25 years ago, he started the Broadbent Wine Production Company and Broadbent Selections, importing wines from over 30 brilliant wineries from Italy, France, Austria, South Africa, Portugal. I'm sure I'm leaving something out. Wine Enthusiast magazine has twice nominated him as the world's best importer. Wine and Spirits says he is one of 10 in the world driving revolutionary changes in wine. Decanter magazine says he is one of 50 most influential in the wine world and exerts a profound influence on the US market. All that right down the street here in Richmond. So please welcome my friend, the Prince of Wine, Bartholomew Broadbent.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I'm going to take this off so you can see me and hear me a little bit better. Thank you for the very kind introduction. It was all a load of rubbish, but actually the one thing you said that I didn't know I had was some sort of master's in science of something or other, but maybe I misheard that back. Anyway, the rest is more or less true, but a bit very kind of you to say. Susan's a good friend, so the pressure is enormous today. I've been in the speaker's lounge for a while, and I'm not sure if it's there to intimidate or inspire, but when you sit there with pictures of previous speakers such as John F. Kennedy, Amelia Earhart, Barbara Bush, and Frank Lloyd Wright, you know the pressure is on. But when I was there, I was having a meeting with my employees on a Zoom type of call, and they could see these speaker pictures behind me, and they asked where my picture was going to be hung. So that's your pressure. I'm going to start this talk with a fun sort of trivia question, and it's about what each of these 12 countries have in common and are unique to these 12 countries. No other countries in the world have it. So the Côte d'Ivoire, Equatorial Guinea, Iraq, maybe you call it Iraq, Kiribati, Micronesia, Mongolia, Nauru, Oman, Palau, Samoa, Sri Lanka, and the United States of America. I'll let you think about that for a bit. I'm not going to answer that question until a bit later. I am going to just tell you a little bit more about my background and my upbringing, because it is very pertinent to my philosophy on wine, which is what this talk is all about. I grew up in England, despite my strong Alabama accent. I actually grew up in England. My father, as Susan mentioned, was in the wine business. He was a director of Christie's. He actually joined them in 1966 to start the wine department for the wine auctions for Christie's. He wrote numerous books about wine. I think there are 50-something titles where he's credited in either being the author or part author of. And he wrote for 433 consecutive months for Decanter magazine. After the 433rd, he just decided he'd had enough, no particular reason. He thought he'd stop because he wrote them every Sunday morning, lying in bed before he got up on Sunday mornings, and decided that his eyes weren't good enough anymore and he was getting bored of it. So I grew up with them, and my parents were not big drinkers, but they did have champagne every morning for breakfast. And the reason for that is because orange juice is just so boring without champagne in it. Other than that, they wouldn't have anything to drink. Well, if you ever visited my father at Christie's in London, the morning coffee was so terrible that he would give you a glass of Madeira instead. But then he wouldn't drink anything else until, well, he always had a drink before lunch, like a Bloody Mary or something like that, but nothing else. And he does have white wine with lunch and red wine with lunch. And then he has a little glass of port after lunch, but nothing else until really, well, actually, if you went to visit him in the afternoon at Christie's, the afternoon tea was so terrible, he'd give you a glass of Madeira. Nothing else until dinner, but he did have a drink before dinner, either gin or whiskey. Then obviously white wine and red wine with dinner. And he would have a little glass of port after dinner. But his doctor said to him, Michael, for your heart, the health of your heart, you've got to have something to drink with alcohol every day before you go to bed. So he has a Grand Marnier. You might think that's a lot. I never saw my parents drunk. Maybe I never saw them sober, I'm not sure. But it comes naturally. Before I was married, I might say, I took a girlfriend to England, and we were having dinner with my grandmother, and my American girlfriend was about to have a glass of water during lunch, and my grandmother went, and my girlfriend said, what's wrong? And my grandmother said, it's water. I don't know how people could drink that. And my girlfriend said, well, don't you drink water? My grandmother said, I never do, never have, never shall. And my girlfriend said to my grandmother, well, what do you drink? And my grandmother said, well, I drink tea, coffee, or wine. And then my girlfriend said to my grandmother, what happens if you're just thirsty and want to drink? My grandmother said, well, I drink gin or whiskey. But you have to remember the history of water. Water is terribly, terribly bad for you, or was. Historically, during the days of the founding fathers, you wouldn't drink water. It was not good for you. It carried cholera and other very bad diseases. So wine and beer were the staple drinks of the founding fathers. But gin came along and screwed up everything for everyone because it really caused problems because people weren't used to high alcohol. Now, I might just mention that when I told that story about my parents drinking wine every day and the amount they drank every day, you might think that is absolutely crazy. But you must remember that wine has changed a lot, and the way that wine is served has changed a lot. I brought 2 glasses with me. I hope to fill one in a few minutes with a bit of wine. This bigger glass is what you might find in a restaurant, And today, restaurants serve maybe 4, maybe 5, but often just 4 glasses per bottle. This is what I grew up drinking wine in. It's a much smaller wine glass. So you might have 3 ounces at the most as a glass of wine, probably more like 2. And that's why you could drink so much more. My parents could drink so much more because they're not drinking enough to get drunk. The other problem is that alcohol levels have increased dramatically. To give an example, when I was moving from California to Virginia, I had a wine cellar in San Francisco and I moved it to Richmond. And every bottle I looked at, every bottle, because a lot of my California wines were from the 60s and 70s and some from the 80s and a handful from the 90s. But all of them were 12.5%, a few, almost all, a few were 13%, a few were 13.5. I think there was one that was 14%, but maybe 2 or 3 which were 13.5. Today, if you go into a wine shop and you look at the backs of bottles of wine, whether it be California, Australia, even France, parts of France, a lot of the wines are 14.5, 15, even 16% alcohol. Now, to give you an idea of the importance of this, let's say Susan, my dear friend Susan Eckes, let's say she drank an entire bottle of wine, which I know she can do, at 15% alcohol, and I drank an entire bottle of wine at 12.5% alcohol. The difference in alcohol intake that Susan had over me is close to 3 vodka tonics. So would you drink a bottle of wine and then ask for 3 vodka tonics? Now, your friends would think you were nuts and had a problem. But that's actually what you did if you drank a bottle of 15% wine instead of 12.5% wine. Or put it another way, let's say you drink 12% alcohol wine, 2 4-ounce glasses of 12% alcohol wine. You're all under the drink drive limit. If you drink 2 4-ounce glasses of 14.5% wine, you're all over the drink drive limit. So for me, alcohol is very important. I grew up drinking wine from the age of 7 every day at home. It was a bit of a problem when I went to boarding school because they didn't allow you to drink at boarding school until you were 16 when you could join the beer club. But when I go to a restaurant today and I'm trying to decide what wine to buy, if they aren't buying my wine, if they don't have my wine on the wine list, which is very frustrating all the time, I will look for wines that I don't know, and I will ask the sommelier or the waiter to pick a bottle, a wine. I'll give him 3 choices in my price point, and I'll say, I want one of these three wines. If it's over 14.5% alcohol, I do not want it. And it's really amusing because they never know. So you see them grabbing the bottles, looking at them. Sometimes the alcohol contents are really hard to find, but they learn something, but they come back and they bring wine. Because I don't drink water. I don't know why they put a bottle of water under here, which I think for me is sort of maybe to rinse my fingers. I'm not sure because of germs, but I do have a bottle of wine here and need to rinse my mouth. So I grew up in England and moved to, well, as Susan said, I worked in Australia, I worked in France, but I moved to North America. I moved to Montreal when I was 20. I was actually working in a wine shop in London before that, and one of my customers came in after a boozy club lunch, and he said they'd like you in North America. And it turned out, and this was because when he was there after that boozy club lunch, we had the directors of Allied Breweries, a big company, in the boardroom in the basement. And so I had to keep this guy quiet. And I shoved him in a cupboard and locked the door. And every 20 minutes, I opened the the door and filled up his glass. And after 5 glasses, he said, they'd like you in North America. And he got me this job in Montreal, and then spent a year there. Then I moved to Toronto with the same company. And then I was recruited by a Portuguese family, English Portuguese family, to start a company for them in San Francisco and to go around America teaching Americans about port. This was in 1985, 86. So not many people knew what port was. It was very, very unknown back then. People were either very old in their Commonwealth clubs or wherever they were, drinking port in leather armchairs, or they were people who were going into their wine shop, corner store, buying a pint of so-called port from the local corner store. They're homeless types. So it was a big education. I had to teach people about port, and that was great fun, going all around the country teaching about port. But then in 1989, the family I worked for bought a bunch of Madeira companies, and they asked me if I could teach Americans about Madeira and sell Madeira too. And of course, I knew the history of Madeira, which has a fantastic history with America. It was, for instance, it was the biggest selling wine in America until Prohibition. The Constitution and Declaration of Independence were both toasted with Madeira. Betsy Ross, when she was saying the flag, had a side table with Madeira. The esteemed judge who has a house here, very famous judge in Richmond, I'm blanking on his name, John Marshall, he would say that he would toast every win in court with a Madeira, but he would insist that it had to be raining when he did that. And he always made the excuse, well, it's raining somewhere in the world. But anyway, in front of a group, the American Wine Society, a couple of years ago, there were about 300 people in the audience, pre-COVID, obviously. And I was telling a story about the history of America and Madeira and how it's even your first tax loophole, because Madeira was invented through shipping to America. It's an island off the coast of Morocco, directly in the trade winds between Europe and America. And all the boats used to stop on Madeira to pick up provisions. And they used to pick up the wine in barrels and use the barrels as ballast in the bottom of the ships and the holds of ships, where they got very warm during the ocean crossings, and it cooked the wine, heated the wine. So to this day, we still simulate the voyage to America by heating the wine to 115 Fahrenheit for 3 months. And that's what creates Madeira. But Prohibition killed it off. And I was telling the story to this group at the American Wine Society and saying, you know, if you read your history books, you'd know all this about your history of America and Madeira. And the tax loophole bit was because King James I, during taxation without representation, said everything coming from Europe, and you drew a big circle around Europe, had to be taxed. But Madeira is off the coast of Morocco, 600 miles off the coast of Morocco. So it looks like it's in Africa, and King James I didn't know that. So it became a tax-free wine to America. But anyway, I said, if you read your history school books on history, you'd know all this. But a woman put up her hand and said, can I just correct you on something? I said, sure. And she said, well, I'm actually a school teacher, and unfortunately, all references to alcohol are removed from children's textbooks. And I thought that explains it. So Madeira was killed off by Prohibition. Basically, 95% of all Madeira was sold in America, and 5% went to England and Russia. But it was killed off by Madeira, but that's what became my profession. I now import wines from all over the world. I make wine in South Africa, Austria, and Portugal, and now California, actually. Just as of past month, we've released our first California wine called Auctioneer. But the Madeira was what I became known for, Port and Madeira. And ironically, when my wife and I moved from San Francisco to Richmond, we bought a house on Monument Avenue, 2300 block of Monument Avenue where we live. And I was astonished to hear, once we moved in, that a very famous event related to prohibition happened in my sunroom. Harry Byrd, who you'll know, was the most powerful politician of the day in 1930s. And the governor in June of 1933 was John Garland Pollard, and Pollard's term was coming to an end. Harry Byrd wanted a politician who would be on his side of whatever spectrum he was on. And George Campbell Peary was suggested, but Pollard was dry and Harry Byrd was incredibly pro-dry. He did not want prohibition to end. But George Campbell Peary wanted prohibition to end. And Harry Byrd wouldn't have any of this at first. But in the end, they had a very secret meeting with Byrd, Peary, and then a guy called Ebby Coombs, who was Byrd's chief advisor. They had this meeting in my sunroom to talk about, and actually the person across the street made moonshine, and they fed it to Harry Byrd, who drank it in huge amounts, not really knowing what effect, how much to drink. But anyway, he ended up changing his mind, and he flip-flopped, and then the long and short of it was that George Campbell Peary got elected to governor 13 days after the General Assembly had agreed to promote the repeal of prohibition. And in the end, obviously on December 5th of 1933, I think it is, that prohibition was repealed. And had it not been for that meeting in our sunroom, Virginia would have been the only other state other than South Carolina that voted against repealing prohibition. So really exciting. And I believe that it was such a controversy at the time that it is the only bill which has been signed away from the state capitol. And apparently it was signed into law in my sunroom as well. So quite extraordinary that my career was Madeira and this connection to prohibition and going full circle today. I do want to talk a little bit about prohibition because it's time we got rid of that headache. Unfortunately, we still have the headache of prohibition. People in America think that that alcohol is bad for you. To such an extent that they teach it in schools. My kids are petrified of Madeira, of alcohol. They're petrified, they don't want to touch it. Meanwhile, my friends in Europe, their 10-year-old kids all trying to guess if it's Pinot Noir or Cabernet, and you know, university students in England are sophisticated enough by then that they have Cambridge and Oxford universities have wine tasting competitions against each other. But it is really important. I think there are some things that it's important to know about prohibition. The National Minimum Drinking Age Act was signed into law in 1984 by Ronald Reagan. It was really promoted by Mothers Against Drink Driving. Now, we are all against drink driving. We are all mothers and fathers. I'm a father. We're totally against drink driving. Uber's helping, by the way, and Lyft are helping. But the raising of the alcohol level to 21 really didn't help. It just moved the accident rate from 21-year-olds to 25-year-olds instead of 18-year-olds to 21-year-olds. And in the early 1980s, in England, Australia, and Europe, basically the drink driving accident rates decreased during the period. So if there was a decrease in accident rates in the US, and they think it was because of the raising of the drink drive age, it's not, because it was happening whether you did that or not through better safety measures in vehicles and stuff like that. The good thing is that the National Minimum Drinking Age Act was only about drinking wine, buying alcohol or possessing alcohol in public. Luckily, there are 29 states, including Virginia, where children are allowed to drink at home with their parents. I think that's really important because we need to educate our children on how to drink wine. There are 6 states where children can drink at home without even their parental consent. There are 8 states which allow children to drink in restaurants with their parents. There are 45 states that have exceptions to drinking under the age of 21. There are only 5 states in the entire country that prohibit anyone from anyone under 21 drinking at all. And by the way, I put on my Facebook, which is Bartholomew Broadbent, I put this morning a thing on my Facebook which gives you the laws for each state. So you can look up your state, and particularly we're all in Virginia, but some people may want to know in other states what the law is in each state. Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands don't have laws for 21 years or age or more. I will just tell you the answer to that first question. What is the one thing that all these countries have in common? The 12 countries: Cote d'Ivoire, Equatorial Guinea, Iraq, Kiribati, Micronesia, Mongolia, Nauru, Oman, Palau, Samoa, Sri Lanka, and the United States. The only thing that all of them have in common is that their drinking age is 21. No other countries in the world have a drinking age that's 21. 160 countries have a drinking age of 18, between 18 and 19. 15 countries have drinking ages below that. And the problem is that I think people think that drinking is bad for you. It's not. My grandmother didn't drink water. She drank, you know the story about her drinking. She died at age 92. My father died last March. He was 92. And actually he had a great last year. He, in 2019, on May 2nd, he turned 92. On May 1st, he published his last book. And on April 25th, he got married for the second time. So, and my mother sadly died about 5 years ago. But alcohol is extremely good for you. Wine, I should say, is extremely good for you. It is the most healthy drink in the world. It has more health properties than any other drink in the world, including water. Wine has so many good things for you. Obviously, if you drink in excess, nothing's good. You can drown drinking water too. But even today with COVID, there's health benefits. There's a guy called Dr. Min Chi Hung. He was a chair of a Department of Molecular and Cellular Oncology in the University of Texas. He's now moved back to Taiwan, but he's studying, he was very prominent studying SARS and now COVID. SARS disappeared, so the sort of studies to how sort of basically disappeared with that. They stopped trying to develop a vaccine for SARS because SARS just totally went away. But what he's suggesting, and he hasn't finished his study, so this isn't yet official, but what he says is that the tannic acid inhibits two enzymes critical to SARS and COVID-19. Tannic acid inhibits the main protease of SARS, which is also the main protease of COVID-19. Tannic acid also inhibits an important enzyme in human cells, TMPRSS2, and this enzyme is on the surface of human cells. When a human is infected by a coronavirus, the virus recognizes this TMPRSS2 on the cell surface and clips it with its spike protein. Now, this is very good news. Some studies about health benefits of wine, there are lots of them. Some you don't have to drink very much of, but others you would have to maybe drink 100 bottles to get the benefit for some diseases. The good thing is that with the COVID-19 impact, you only have to drink 1 liter of red wine a day, which is quite exciting. And he goes on to say, the low dose might have a mild preventative effect. And he says, if 2 people are infected by the same amount of virus, but one drinks wine and the other one doesn't, the one who drinks the tannic acid, their protection will be stronger than the other. So wine is even good for COVID. But it's the lesson, the study is ongoing, so we don't quite know that totally yet. But one of the wines, you may wonder why this bottle is sitting here. It's because now I'm getting thirsty and I need a little sip of something. And it's conveniently in a screw top, so you can, and just because I'm practical, I'm gonna have a small glass. But the interesting thing about this wine, well, this is one of my wines. You might have seen it. It's available pretty much everywhere in Richmond. It's a Vinho Verde. It comes from Portugal. We make it in Portugal, called Broadbent Vinho Verde. This little flower, the little orange flower, was painted by my niece when she was 4 years old. Unfortunately, she's now 21 saying, hey, where's my... But it's been a huge success. And one of the things I love about this wine is it's only 9% alcohol. So you think the impact of drinking 15% wine, how little impact it has on you drinking 12% wine. This you can drink a lot of without a problem. In fact, I shouldn't say this, but I have on occasion been known to drink an entire bottle of this and drive, and I know that I'm under the high alcohol level limit, but don't quote me on that because I don't know for sure. I just know that my ability to do anything is not affected by this, because 9% alcohol to me is almost non-alcoholic. I hope you've all had that wine. Can I see a show of hands, anyone who's had that wine? Excellent. And we did send out a thing saying, for those who are watching this at home, saying you should go and buy a bottle of this and drink it whilst you're listening to me, because it'll make your enjoyment of this lecture far greater. So low alcohol is very, very essential. Climate change, I told, when I signed up for this lecture, I said I'd discuss a bunch of different things. I'd talk about climate change, the business during COVID, that's really, I guess, topical. So I'm a wine importer. We represent 40 different wineries around the world. And we produce our own, as I mentioned, in the countries. It's interesting because our sales overall during the past year declined only 13%, which is really not bad considering that some of our wines, like we import an English sparkling wine called Gusbourne, that was 95% in restaurants. So wines like that have suffered dramatically, but we have gone out looking for new routes to market. And thankfully, people are drinking a lot more wine at home. I hope you all are. Sadly, we all lament the fact that the restaurants have been suffered so much, and we feel dreadfully sorry for everyone who works in that industry, and we hope it comes back. But wine consumption has dramatically increased with retailers. And for us, wines like this, which are about $10 a bottle, not very expensive, that sort of wine has gone up really dramatically. And then the other type of wine we find is selling very well is very, very expensive wines, because people are more happy to fork out wine at retail prices to drink at home than to pay the high markups in restaurants. So those have gone up. The tough area is wines, in the $30, $40 range, which are struggling a bit. You don't have to pay that much for a good wine. It doesn't cost more than $30 to make any wine in the world. The most expensive wine to make is probably Chateau Yquem in Bordeaux, and it doesn't cost $30 to make. Okay, some very wealthy people have put gazillions of dollars into fancy wineries, and so yeah, if you want to pay off that investment, you'd have to sell your wine for a lot more, but really that's not the cost of making the wine. The white cost, it doesn't, if you contact me on my website, broadbent.com, or send me an email, want advice on wines under $25, which are as good as any wines in the world, we have them, I can tell you about them. You can get great wines under $25. You can get very good wines under $15, exceptionally good wines. Climate change has impacted every single wine region in the world, but the English are actually doing rather well from it, because England had a rotten climate for winemaking, and now we make some of the best wines in the world. It's been fantastic, but unfortunately, the rest of the world has complained, and the impact is that we're picking grapes about 4 to 6 weeks earlier than we were 10 years ago. So it's any farmer will tell you the same thing probably. New wine regions are emerging, fantastic new wine regions. I highly recommend you look for wines from South Africa, and my wife drinks at home a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc called Spy Valley, which we've been drinking every day for 15 years. And when I started Broadbent Selections, I didn't go to the classic regions of France and Italy, although we do now represent wines from there. But I went to the emerging regions like Portugal and South Africa and Chile and Argentina and New Zealand and Australia, and you get great wines from all these countries. It doesn't have to be French or Italian to be good. When I'm in a restaurant, I told you about how I don't think I finished the story about how I pick wines. So the restaurateur comes back with a selection of wines that is 12% or 13% or 14% alcohol, and isn't going to bring me the wine above 14.5 because I don't want it. Because lower alcohol goes better with food. But yeah, I've just lost my train of thought. But oh yeah, I know what I was going to say. When I am in a restaurant, I don't know certain wines on the list. The best thing to do is ask a sommelier what they recommend, or the wine manager what they recommend. But I always avoid the section that says Chardonnay, Cabernet, Merlot, because I know that those wines are the most overpriced because they're the most in demand, and anyone who's buying Chardonnay, Cabernet or Merlot is going to want those, and they're a captive market. But the sommeliers love to promote wines which are unknown. So Lebanon, Chateau Musard from Lebanon is a classic example. My favorite wine in the world, in fact, is this Lebanese wine called Chateau Musar, M-U-S-A-R. And I find that if you go to the other sections, sometimes a restaurant wine list might say interesting others, or sommelier's favorites, or indeed in a wine shop, go and ask the wine manager in a fine wine shop and say, what are your favorite wines that aren't Cabernet, Merlot, or Chardonnay? Because there you're getting better value wines because there isn't a huge demand for those wines. So the wines are more honestly priced and really, wines live a long time. My father, with his career in Christie's, his expertise was old and rare wines. And the oldest wine I ever had was accommodated to 1670. It was a white wine, only 6% alcohol. So we know that the founding fathers were probably, when they were drinking wine as their staple, it was probably only 6 to 10% alcohol back then, maybe 12 at the most. But that 1670 wine was perfectly, it had been buried in London clay. They were excavating to build something, and they found these bottles. They tested some to make sure it wasn't poison, and then they rang my father. Happened that I was in his study when the call came through, and he said, Mr. Broadbent? I said, yes. And they said, we're just reminding you about the tasting tomorrow and of the 1670 wine. And I said, oh, I think you might be wanting to talk to my father. And this person said, oh, yes. And I said, but what is the wine? And they said, well, we're not sure. It's either from Madeira or the Canary Islands. And I said, well, I happen to be in the Madeira business. And I said nothing and waited until it came back and said, well, you can come along too if you want. So that was rather fun. Virginia wines, I love Virginia wines. Actually, we represent Barbourville outside of Virginia. In all the other states, we represent Barbourville, which is one of the top wineries. But I think I'm a judge every year for the Governor's Cup. And this year we did it. It was really interesting. They sent little small bottles of each wine to our offices, and we tasted them remotely. But Virginia wines are spectacularly good as any wines in the world. Don't let anyone say they aren't as good, because they are great. The wine business has changed a lot since I moved to America. When I moved to America in '85, I remember getting on a plane once and seeing someone reading a Wine Spectator. And I actually moved seats to sit next to this person because it was so unusual to see anyone with any interest in wine. Obviously today, we all drink wine. Most of you, I'm sure, love to drink wine. Especially if you've got kids. My twins are 15 years old, so my wife and I drink our fair share of wine in the evening just to get through the day. But I think, just going back to the theme of prohibition, it's time to recognize that wine is good for you. And I think, whereas 25 years ago, no one knew about wine, now you all know about wine, you all like wine, you all know it's good for you. So I just don't understand why we're telling children that alcohol is bad for you when wine is so healthy. I'd love to open this up to questions.
Thank you. Good. But yes.
Is there a particular region in this country that may not be recognized yet as the upcoming wine region that you can point us to?
I was asked to repeat every question. So is there a particular region in this country, the United States, which is an up-and-coming wine region that is not yet recognized but is potentially great? Every state makes wine now. Every single state has a winery or makes wine. I would say that outside of Virginia, Virginia is still not recognized as a great wine region. It is in England, people know it. In China, people know it because you've had governors and the Virginia Wine Bureau who've gone to promote Virginia wines in China and England. And I'm doing my best to promote it outside, but it's really difficult because one of the problems with Virginia wines is the wineries are very small. So they don't have the land to grow to need to expand in all other states. So whereas I think Virginia is as good as Washington and Oregon and California, New York is a big wine state and they make some good wines, but it tends to be focused on wines like Rieslings and those sort of wines are the great wines there. But Virginia makes great wines, world-class wines from all sorts of different varieties. And in fact, we did an event about, I know, maybe eight or 9 years ago. And it was a tasting of Virginia wines against benchmark wines. And in every case, either the Virginia wine beat the benchmark wines from around the world. Virginia wines either beat them or came equal. And there's one particular wine, a wine made by Barbersville and Nebbiolo, and we had it against a very famous wine from Italy, Verde Sparolo. And at the show of hands, there were about 300 people in the room. We did this tasting and we asked for a show of hands who liked number wine best. About 95% put their hands up. Who likes number two best? A few put their hands up. And then when we told them that number one was the Barbersville Nebbiolo, there was an audible gasp of shock. So Virginia, I'd say, makes great wines. I mean, there are other good wine regions. Texas makes some nice wines. Lots of states make some nice wines, but I think to be a great wine producing state, I think you really have 5 in this country at the moment. Virginia, Oregon, Washington, California, and New York. The rest are good, but not the greatness of Virginia.
Why is the alcohol content of wine, why has it gone up such? Is it on purpose? Is it forced this way, or is it some other change in the production, or why?
Yeah, so the question is, why have alcohol contents risen so much? And I think also you've got to remember that we as human beings have been drinking wine for well over 7,000 years. I mean, we've got evidence of winemaking, which is 7,000 years old. So evolution, human beings and wine have evolved together. We weren't the first people to get drunk or drink wine. Grapes were dropping on the floor, being eaten by birds, or apes, monkeys were picking grapes and eating them long before humans. But our brains during evolution have been accustomed to wines of 12% or less. And so that's why we get drunk. We can share a bottle of wine of 12% alcohol, 12.5% alcohol. 2 people can share a bottle of wine and even want a glass of port afterwards. But the trouble is, wine is only since about the late 1990s that these alcohol levels have gone up so much. And our brains haven't evolved with this technology. And there are a number of factors. One is, there was a wine writer called Robert Parker who loved high, intense, concentrated, high alcoholic wine. So, and his power of, his scoring power sold a lot of wine. So a lot of people around the world started trying to make wines to please this all-powerful wine writer. So that was one reason they started trying to make wines. They would also, yeast. When I started selling port in America in 1985, yeasts couldn't ferment above 16% alcohol. So, so that's when you add the brandy to the port and it stops the fermentation because it kills the yeast. So the wine is nice and sweet from sugars which didn't get converted. But today we have manipulated yeast so that they can be fermenting higher. Some people blame climate change on this high alcohol phenomena. I don't go with that because you can still make very elegant, refined, low alcohol wines in climates, in today's climate. So though climate change is real and affecting the wine business, it's not what's causing alcohol levels to go up. Yes?
I'd like you to speak just a little bit about Madeira. I hate to say I'm ignorant. I've never drank a glass of Madeira and I have my share of wine, but I've only used it for cooking.
Yeah, and the important thing to you, if you are using it for cooking, you want to get a good Madeira, because it's like any ingredients, your food's only as good as that. And plus, if you have a good Madeira, you can drink it whilst you're cooking. And put some in the food. But also the way that we make Madeira is to cook it. So it's heated for 3 months at 115 Fahrenheit. That's what creates Madeira. So when you cook with a true Madeira, you don't lose the flavor when you put it into your food. Whereas if you buy some sort of domestic thing that's called Madeira, which has no relation to real Madeira, when you cook with it, you burn off the flavor and you have to keep using it to get the flavor back. So you use a lot more of it, even though it's cheaper wine, you use a lot more because you don't have the intensity of flavor. But Madeira is a wine which ranges from dry to sweet, excuse me, dry to sweet. And it can be, if you get a dry or medium dry Madeira, try it with cheese. It's delicious before dinner with cheese or with nuts before dinner. It's the only wine that can go with salad because it's got a very high natural acidity. It's the only wine that can go with dessert because dessert wines are usually sweet, and when you put them against the sweetness of the dessert, it kills it, makes it taste watery. But Madeira, even the sweet ones, have a dry finish to them. So when you put it with a dessert, it doesn't clash with the sweetness of dessert because the Madeira is already naturally finishing dry. So it's the best wine for desserts. It is a fortified wine, so it's 19% alcohol. So it's not a sort of dinner wine that you chug back with your main course, although it's been done with nice big rich steaks that you have Madeira. But I personally prefer regular table wine. But it's either, I'd say, before dinner or after dinner or with dessert. Those are the times to use it. And it's a lovely sort of, I don't know, caramelly, sort of raisiny, somewhat like a tawny port or a sherry, but nicer. Well, I'd have to just say my own. So Broadbent, the grape variety is Cercial. So the S-E-R-C-I-A-L. So Cercial is driest, Verde is medium dry, Boal is medium sweet, and Malmsey is sweet. If you go to any good wine shop, and there are several in Richmond, ask them for the Broadbent Madeiras. Some of them have them already, but they can get them for you overnight. And yeah, I'd try the Cercial if you want a dry one.
Blue, I've mentioned that you were a master of the science of wine and the artistry as well. And we have a number of questions from the people watching remotely about the science of wine, biodynamics, additives to enhance, but something we haven't touched on is your expertise in the history of wine, and also your resourcing. And one of the better questions, I think, is how did you find the Chateau Mazar?
Yeah, I do have a history with wine. Specifically, how did I find, how am I sourcing my wines? Well, at this point, my company is established, so we have the fortune of the greatest wineries in the world approaching us. But back when I started this company, Broadbent Selections, in 1996, and by the way, the website is called broadbent.com, we weren't established. I had a reputation for Port and Madeira back then, but I wasn't established. But when I was growing up, my sister and I were used as slave labor by my parents. So when my father was going around Europe, France, Austria, Germany, in search of great wine cellars to auction, because auctions didn't exist before 1966 for wine. Wine auctions didn't exist. He went around pillaging all the great wine cellars of the world and finding all these great cellars, which some which hadn't been open for 100 years. They'd just been in castles and sort of forgotten. So we were used, my mother and I would be in the cellar. My father would be sitting in the deck chair in the sunshine outside. My mother and I would be sent to the cold, damp cellars to pull out the bottles. She'd write them down. Then we'd smuggle them back to England in the boot of our car with 2 young children, the very, very best wines like the 1806 Chateau Lafite, which went for a world price record. That was just smuggled in the boot of the car. And when the customs agent opened it and saw this family, opened it and saw the children's dirty laundry sitting on top, they didn't look underneath. They just waved us through. But Chateau Musard was that example. I was at the Bristol Wine Fair in 1979 when the war in Lebanon was so terrible they couldn't sell their wine there anymore. So the winemaker Serge Hochard came to my father and said, "I want to show you my wine from Lebanon." And my father was incredibly impressed and declared it the discovery of the year. And he gave it to me to taste. I think I was 16 at the time, something like that. And immediately I said, "That's the best wine I've ever had." And I've always said that's my favorite wine. When I got married here in Richmond, Virginia, it was the only red wine I had at my wedding and rehearsal dinner. So, so when I started my company, Serge Hochard, and I'd worked with him in Canada at the previous 2 companies earlier. When I moved to Canada, they represented that wine. So I got to know the owner. And when I started my company, he said, "Well, I'll wait to make sure you make it, and then I'd love you to sell our wine." So after a couple of years, he appointed us as the importer. So a lot of that sort of thing is how you find wines. Yeah.
So interesting. We have so many more questions than we can even get to, but we'll all look forward to a wine tasting in the near future, I hope.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You can do your own wine tastings at home.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.